Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. While you're turning there, last time we took a look at the faith of some of the patriarchs of the Jews, even before they became a nation of people. That included Isaac, which was Abraham's son, and then Isaac's son Jacob, who later became known as Israel, and Joseph, his son. And all of them gave assurance about the promises of God that hadn't even happened in their lifetime. Passed that on down to the following generation near their deaths. And so we talked about the best way to bless our children isn't to leave them something after we're gone. It's to continue to reaffirm the promises of God to them all the way to our death. And I was talking to a lady today, and she was talking about some work that was going on in her neighborhood on Sunday morning. And she said, the one day I get to sleep in. Now, I know she goes to church. And so she said, but they were up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And she said, working. And she said, but we get to sleep in on Sunday morning. She said, we don't have to go to Sunday school anymore because my mom and dad don't teach Sunday school anymore. What? What she said there. But that's not exactly what parents hope for in their children, that we don't have to go because mom and dad aren't teaching or mom and dad aren't making us go or whatever it is. And so we want to reaffirm that even in our grown children, how important that is to continue to stay close to God, continue to pass that on to the following generations. But all three of those people, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, they all failed in areas of faith as far as their lives were concerned. But that was after they were saved. They never wavered about their faith, about what God said would happen. Those events, especially concerning the promised land and the heir, the descendant of all nations would be blessed through, which of course was Christ. But even though they didn't see those things for themselves, they still believed them, just like they were going to happen at any time there. We move into this next few verses. We're going to see another key figure in the history of the Jewish people. This is Moses. He comes on the scene just as the Israelites are being birthed into a nation. Now, when they went down to Egypt during the famine, there, of course, Joseph has come to power there, went down slave, ended up second to Pharaoh, is in charge of the food supplies, all those kind of things, and reunited with the family. He brings the family down there. When they come down there, there's only about 70 to 75 people. That's all there is to the whole Jewish nation. We call it a family, a big family at that time, not a nation yet. They grew into a nation of people later on. There in chapter 11, verse 23, read down through verse 29. He says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, assaying to do, were drowned. Now, of course, this is a condensed version of the life of Moses. The life of Moses spans from the book of Exodus in the Old Testament through Deuteronomy 34, where he dies. And so there's a lot involving Moses' life. But we've seen this many times already. Judaism, when it moves to the New Testament, has been corrupted. It's become a works-based system. They think you have to do something and believe in God to be saved. And at that point, it's a false religion. You can't save anybody. It's not faith plus works. It's just faith. And so, but the Jews thought that Moses was a pattern of the Old Testament law. It's even called the Mosaic Law after his name. That's not because Moses was a pattern of how to keep the law. It's because he was the one God gave it to, and then he was to give it to everybody else, the rest of the people. Moses is not a pattern for how a person can be saved by keeping the law. Not even close. He's another proof that salvation can only be by faith alone. Moses violated the law in multiple ways, as we'll see some of that going forward. But Moses believed God by faith for salvation. And then he demonstrated his faith by some choices that he makes throughout his lifetime. Now, some of these choices, most people would never make that choice. If given these two options that Moses had, most people would never pick the one that Moses picked. But he picks those by faith. And we understand life is a series of choices. And some will try to excuse sin, and they'll say, well, I just made some bad choices. Yeah, I made some bad choices too. They were sin. all sin is a bad choice. You can't just pawn it off on that. It's a rejection of God in some way. It's outside of an act of faith in God. That's like when people say it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You ever hear somebody say that? Oh, you got to do this. You got to do this. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Every opportunity is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. What you brush your teeth with tomorrow will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Because tomorrow is never going to come another day. Every day is a new day. It's a unique day. The situations are going to change from day to day. No matter how hard you try. I'm a person of habit. I get that. I'm a little OCD. I'm a lot OCD. But I do things by habit. And so if somebody breaks my habit, that derails me sometimes. I was telling Joe I needed to get a haircut before church today. It'd get pretty shaggy looking, but my barber closes at 4:30. I don't normally get off till 4:30. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to skip my lunch today. I'll get off at 4. I'll have time to get to the barber, get there. I pull up to the middle school there in Wurtland, and there's a curb there. I know there's a curb there. Most of the time I'm jumping up in the mail truck from the ground level, but I know there's a curb there in Wurtland. Right? Somebody talked to me. They just hollered at me. Hey, how you doing? I turned around, spoke to them, and turned and jumped up in the truck. And that's how I got that place right there. Right? And so, but it just takes a little bit to derail me. But I make that choice all the time. Right? I crack my skull on that. I don't know how often I do it. Sheila's rolling her eyes. Right? She teases me that I... What is it you say? I know something about more injuries than any person she knows that ain't blind. Right?
I say lots of things.
Right. And she's talking about wanting me to wear a helmet to work and those kind of things. But you know, we make choices though all the time. We make those kind of choices. But every opportunity is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You're never going to have that exact same scenario again. Some are going to be real similar, but it's not going to be exactly the same all the time. And Deuteronomy 30, I'll give you a few verses about this. Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, he says, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Joshua 24:15, a very familiar verse, says, And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And in 1 Kings 18:21, and Elijah came unto all the people and said, How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not a word. Now that last one's a little scary. It is. We have to choose life and blessing by choosing God. If we don't choose God, we're choosing something or someone else. But those who don't choose anything, what are they choosing? They're rejecting God. They're choosing the something else, whether they want to admit it or not. You can't just not choose. Anybody that doesn't choose automatically goes to Satan's side. They're by default. But we've talked about this as we've been studying through this chapter. Abel was the first example we saw. Abel chose God's way, God's sacrifice, and he received life and blessings there. Enoch chose to walk with God. He received life and blessings. Noah chose to work with God. He received life and blessings. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they all chose to obey, follow God. They received life and blessings. But faith is choosing God's way even when it doesn't make sense to us. Even when it doesn't make sense to us. Even when other people would say it's foolish. People would definitely say these choices that Moses made here about Egypt and home and who he attached himself, they'd say that's foolishness. Foolishness there. But Moses does it anyway, in spite of some failures along the way. Now we're going to skip verse 23 for now. We're going to come back to it a little later on. But I want to start with some of the things. These are things that faith, true faith, rejects. There in Hebrews 11:24, he says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, that's a pretty prestigious title, to be a grandson of the Pharaoh. He's rejecting that prestige of that position there. That was an adopted child. Moses is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and he would, of course, be Pharaoh's grandson. But we'll see some details about that in a minute. But Pharaoh saw, you remember, the Hebrew people as a threat. They're multiplying. They're growing too quickly. They are becoming like a nation of people, even though they don't have any kind of leadership, any kind of government yet, nothing like that. But they're multiplying too quickly, and he's afraid they're going to outnumber the Egyptians. That's what's happening there. And God is blessing them. And so Pharaoh starts trying to think of ways to shrink the Israelite population. You remember what the attempt was? The midwives, the Egyptian midwives, they'd help during birth. And Pharaoh says, when you're helping the Israelites have a child, if a boy comes out, they're supposed to kill it. And then if it's a girl, it didn't care. Now, why didn't they care if the Israelite girls lived? If there's no Israelite boys for them to marry, they'll marry an Egyptian man. And if the man is Egyptian, what will the family become? Egyptian. And so he's intending on breeding them out that way. But the midwives would not do that. I don't know who could do that. Any kind of normal, reasonable person could choke the life out of a newborn baby. But that's what he was asking them to do. And when they didn't do that, God still protected them. God still blessed them for that. And so then he goes to the next scheme. They are trying to diminish the Israelites by slave labor. They're going to work them to death. And they're doing hard labor, making bricks, those type of things. And so slaves generally don't live that long. That's what Joseph's brothers thought when they sold him into slavery. He's going to go, they're going to work him to death, and he's going to die young. That's just how it happened there. But God was protecting Israel through that also, and so it wasn't shortening their lives. They're still reproducing, doing all those kind of things. And then a last-ditch effort, Pharaoh makes the command to everybody and says, here's how we're going to get rid of him. We're not going to depend on the Egyptian midwives to handle that. If you see an Egyptian male, an Israelite male baby, a Hebrew baby, they were to do what with it? Throw it in the river. Just drown it. That's what they would do. And so that's an ugly scene, and that's happening. That's happening. And a lot of the Hebrew babies were killed that way. But Moses' parents hid him 3 months. Now, when those babies are newborn, they don't make much noise, do they? It's just a real whimpery kind of, at first. And then they start getting a little lung capacity on them. You get to 3 months old, they can wake a neighborhood. They can. And so they can't hide him anymore. At 3 months old, it's not feasible. And so they finally trust him to God's care. They make a little small ark for him, like a little basket, and pitched it so it would float there, placed it along the edge of the Nile River, and had his older sister Miriam follow it to see what would happen. And just like Noah's Ark that we talked about a while back, this little ark, little basket that he's in, has no propulsion, no way for it to move itself. There's no way for it to be steered, of course, by a baby, 3-month-old baby couldn't steer it anyway. And so, but God is steering it. And he steers it to a place where Pharaoh's daughter would be bathing there. And she sees it. They fetch it, bring it to her, bring the basket to her. And when she opens it up, what does little baby Moses do? He cries. He cries, and it's so pitiful. So pitiful. And it breaks her heart. Now, by Pharaoh's command, she's supposed to do what? Take it out of that basket and chuck it in the river. That's what she's supposed to do. But she's not heartless. And she cannot do that. So she is going to save this baby. And if anybody can get away with that, it would be Pharaoh's daughter. And that's when she takes the baby, that's when Miriam seems to appear from nowhere and says, "Do you want me to find one of the Hebrew women to nurse it?" She can't nurse it. She hasn't had a child, so she's not producing milk. And so they said, "Well, how about I find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Which ends up being Moses' own mother. And she gets to care for him there until he ends up in Pharaoh's house. Now back in Exodus 2, verse 5 and 6, we'll see a few of these verses. Exodus 2, 5 and 6, "And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.'" Now, how does Pharaoh's daughter know that this is one of the Hebrew babies? Well, do Egyptian women need to hide their babies? No, certainly wouldn't leave one unattended in a basket there. What about this? Did the Egyptian women circumcise their male children? Nope, that's only Jews. That's only Jews. And so she very quickly puts the pieces together. This is a Hebrew baby. It's circumcised. It's abandoned here in the riverbank there. And so she knows this is one of their babies. There in verse 7 to 9, Exodus 2, he says, "Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, 'Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages.' And the woman took the child and nursed it." And so Moses' mother actually gets paid to raise and nurse her own son during those years. Now, we don't know the details about his childhood, right? But we know that Moses' mother isn't brought into Pharaoh's house for that purpose. She's not like a live-in nanny. She's not like that. And so Moses' mother has him alone for a period of time. We do know they nursed longer than we do, women do, not we, but women do now, because they didn't have things like baby oatmeal or food or whatever those type of things are. And a lot of table food is too strong for a baby. And so they nursed them for longer periods of time back then. And so we don't even know if she does even after that nursing point, if she serves as some kind of a nanny or something for Pharaoh. But we do know this. He's there long enough to understand about who his family really is, who their God is there. And so he has that foundation there with his real family. And he has that established before he ever goes to Pharaoh's house. Before he ever goes there. We talk about all the time about the importance of raising our children in church. Now, raising your children in church doesn't mean just exposing them to church once in a while. That's not what that means. It's not that they can talk about God or they can say grace over their food. No, it's that foundation where they recognize these stories as they get older, and then you can go deeper into them as they become adults. But we want God's foundation there at those young years, because the world is going to try to lure them into something else. That's always going to happen. It'll always. Right? We can't shield our children from everything in the world. That's impossible. We can protect them from a lot while they're at home, but they have to leave home. They can't stay there all the time, and they are going to be exposed to those things. And we want them attached to God's things, that solid foundation before they get out into that where sin is rampant and the world's way is rampant there. But so we want that strong foundation. We want their rock, their foundation, to be God. We know the illustration about the wise man built his house upon the rock. Right? The foolish man built on what? Sand. That's the world. The world just builds on sand. There's no real foundation to it. It looks good. It's quick. It's easy. Right? We'll do that. But as Moses moves from his parents' home to Pharaoh's household, he can see the difference. He can see what the Hebrew people have been building their lives on. And then he can see what the Egyptians are building their lives on. And by faith, he believes God's way is better. It is. There in verse 24 of Hebrews 11, he says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And as we said, there's a lot of prestige in being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But there's no connection to God in that. The Egyptians didn't have any connection to God. It's all those false gods. There in Exodus 2, 11 and 12, he says, and it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Anybody know how old Moses is when that event happens? How many years did he spend in Pharaoh's house? Do you know? 3 stages to Moses' life. Pharaoh's house, the land of Midian, and then back with the children of Israel in the wilderness journey. But it's 40 years. That's the first 40 years of his life. When this event happens and he kills the Egyptian, he is 40 years old. He's a grown man. He's been exposed to a lot in the Egyptian culture. Here's Stephen talking about Moses in Acts 7, 22 and 23, right before he's stoned to death. But there in Acts 7:22, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So when he turns 40, he has a burden for his people, and he visits them. Royalty doesn't associate with the slave labor that's making brick. They don't. They've got some slave servants that live in the palace. They have a little interaction with them, not much, but certainly not those who are out doing the brute labor, the hard labor there. And so he's got a burden for them, and he goes out and visits them. And so he's gotten pretty comfortable in the royal family. I mean, that's a pretty cushy life to be raised in Pharaoh's house, in the palace. But he's still got that burden. That foundation was still there from when he was very young. And he needs to see them. He needs to see what's going on. These are his people, the Hebrew people there. And he knows now how Pharaoh does business. He knows about the laws of the Egyptians. there. He is well aware that murder is not accepted by the Egyptian law. He knows that. But he also knows that if it can't be proven, it can't be punished. If they can't catch him killing somebody, then they can't do anything to him. Now, it's not acceptable behavior for Moses to kill the Egyptian, even though he thinks he's helping his own people. And they've been mistreated a lot as a whole, not just this one there. But that's not God's way of dealing with it. When we have people that we do that don't approve of, we don't beat them up, smack them around, kill them, whatever the case may be. That's not God's answer to dealing with those problems. But Moses did kill this man. And then he hid the body. Now, when he hid the body, who's the only ones that knows about it now? Well, God does. But who else? You remember the Egyptian was mistreating an Israelite. And he looks this way, and he looks this way, and there's nobody around but him, the Egyptian, and the Israelite, one of his brethren there. When he kills the Egyptian, who's the only one that knows about it? One of his own people, the Israelite, and of course God there. And so, surely one of his own people wouldn't tell that. The one that he stood up for, that was being mistreated, the one that he took his part and killed this man, got rid of that problem there. Surely that person wouldn't tell, would he? People like to tell, don't they? They do like to tell, even though it helped him. It wasn't right, it wasn't good, but it did help him. And people can't resist telling the dirt on other people there, even if it's for their own benefit. Now, how long does it take before this guy that he just helped spreads the news? Well, here's the next verse. Exodus 2:13 through 15. And when he went out the second day, the next day, he went out the first day, he saw the Israelite being mistreated by the Egyptian, looked this way, looked that way, nobody's around, he kills the Egyptian, buries his body in the sand. Right? The next day, he says, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. So these 2 of his own people fighting with each other. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Again, one of his own people blurts this out loud, and anybody can hear then. And then it gets back to Pharaoh, and then everybody knows. Everybody knows. So his own people sold him out to Pharaoh. They felt like he was trying to make himself a prince over them, a judge over them. That's what the Jews did to Jesus, didn't it? Sold him out to Pharaoh. Sold him out there. Egypt is one of the most powerful nations in the world at this time. They're the most sophisticated society. And so Moses would have enjoyed privileges in Pharaoh's house that most couldn't even imagine in everyday life, let alone the Israelites who were in slavery there. And so he's got power, he's got fame, he's got servants, he's got all the luxuries of life, all wrapped up in his adopted family. His adopted family. And now he has to choose. He has to choose. Now Moses has already chosen God. He's felt the call of God to be a deliverer to God's chosen people. That's why he went out and checked on his brethren. He's already responded to that call there. But because he did it out of vengeance instead of doing it God's way, how long does it take him before he can actually deliver them with God's help? Well, the first 40 years are in Pharaoh's house. And then he flees from Pharaoh, afraid of being punished for murdering the Egyptian, and he goes to the land of Midian. How long is he there? 40 years. 40 more years. 40 more years there. When Moses finally chose to stand with his people, they're the slaves in Egypt. He's already chosen God over the prestige of Egypt. He's rejected all that the world has to offer in exchange for a better kingdom, a better king than Pharaoh, a higher calling of God. And so that's Moses acting by faith. If a person acted by sight, which would they choose? Egyptian royalty or Egyptian slavery? You choose the royalty. Right? You choose that by sight. But by faith, he chooses the slavery. He chooses to be with his own people. 1 John 2:16, very familiar verse for us. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And so Moses has to deny himself those lusts, the pride, right, in order to be associated with God's people. And that's the privilege that the world has to offer. So what else does Moses reject? There in verse 25, Hebrews 11, he says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. He doesn't just reject the privileges and of these position, but the pleasures of sin. They don't last, though. They're for a season. Isaiah 21:4, he says, my heart panteth, fearfulness affrighted me. The night of my pleasure hath he turned into fear unto me. Many aren't afraid of where the pleasures of sin are leading them until it's too late. Until it's too late, till they have to stand before God. I'm sure that David never imagined the heartache that would follow. He had a moment of pleasure with Bathsheba in that affair. I'm sure he had no idea of the heartache that would follow through his own family, through his own sons that we've been going through on Sunday morning. But Moses rejected the temporary pleasures of sin. For this, Psalm 16:11, thou wilt shew me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. And so he went from having everything that the world could offer to having nothing that the world could offer. You remember what his occupation is? He has to work for his father-in-law. He does meet a woman, get married in the land of Midian. You remember what his occupation was? What kind of lavish career did he have in the land of Midian? He's a shepherd. He's a shepherd. That's just one step up from a slave. That's the poorest occupation a person could have in Bible times outside of slavery. That's what he did for the next 40 years there. That's what he traded it for. Right? But it's a conscious effort. He's rejecting the temptations of the world. He's going to suffer the temporary afflictions with his own people. So he rejects the prestige. He rejects the pleasures of sin. There, all by faith. Here's another one, Hebrews 11:26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Now he rejects earthly riches that he can see for heavenly ones that he can only see by faith. He can only see by faith. And it's not some kind of whimsical decision there. He's considered the options. He's compared one against the other. And his judgment, God's riches far outweigh Pharaoh's riches. That's the comparison there. You remember Jesus had to leave his throne in heaven to be born into humanity. He had to leave that place of prestige, that position there, that place of riches there in the Father's house. He had to leave heaven, had to be humbled, made a little lower than the angels when he took on a human form. All for what purpose? To die. To die. But what did he gain by dying and being resurrected? Us. Us. He provided salvation for us. There in Hebrews 11:27, Moses again, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Now Moses isn't afraid anymore of the earthly king. The earthly king, Pharaoh, can take his physical life. But God is the protector of eternal life. He didn't just leave Egypt. He rejected everything about Egypt. It's a total abandonment of sin and the world. That's the picture we get here in Proverbs 29:25. He says, the fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. Safe. Now there have been some men of faith who did not live outside of the fear of man like Moses did. They were afraid of what men could do to them. David, we know, was afraid of Saul. He starts off, he's not afraid of anybody. Not afraid of Goliath. He's not afraid of anybody at first because he's dependent on God. And then he quits depending on God and he starts depending on himself, and he's afraid of Saul, and he tries to abandon God's territory there. Thought Saul was getting too close and he's eventually going to get me, right? And stop trusting God for a time, and then God has to bring him back. Abraham is another example. You remember he was afraid that they'd kill him because Sarah was so beautiful. And so instead of trusting God, he lied, said that she was his sister. Twice he did that. Later his son Isaac did the same thing with his wife Rebekah. But Moses comes back from the land of Midian, 40 years in Pharaoh's house, 40 years in the land of Midian. He comes back, he's 80 years old. He faces the king of Egypt again. Now, he can still take his life for murdering the Egyptian 40 years before that. He was still a murderer. He can still do that there. But he's not afraid. He's not afraid. And God starts targeting through the plagues. We don't have time to go through it this evening, but you can trace back every plague that God allows to happen to Egypt to one of Egypt's false gods. And every time God proves, no matter what God does to the land, no matter what plague he sends, their God can't stop it because they're not real. They're not real. And he goes all the way to the last one, which is the death of the firstborn. That's the first Passover. There in Hebrews 11:28, he says, through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. You remember when they killed the Passover lamb? Had to be less than a year old. The baby lamb. They had to keep it, put it up, which means they probably brought it into the house where the kids would love on it. And Josh talking about loving on his dog and his turkey there before church. And I get tickled at that every time I hear it, so it's pretty good. But the turkey gets jealous if the dog hugs him first, right? Is that right, Josh? I'm understanding that right? And then the turkey comes and tries to flog the dog to get its hug. But, that's a dog and a turkey. Now, you imagine a baby lamb, how the kids in the home will get attached to that. Even the parents wouldn't want to see that, but they have to kill it. They have to take the blood then, take the hyssop and splatter it on the door and the lintel. And then the destroyer will see the blood and pass over that house there that night. But true faith rejects the prestige of sin, the pleasures of sin, the riches, temporary riches of sin. What does it accept? Now, I told you we'd be back at verse 23. Hebrews 11:23. He says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Now, we're going to Moses' parents' faith to begin with there. They accept God's command over an earthly authority. Now, when Moses was born, it says he was a proper child. Now, that can mean just fair or handsome there, right? But every parent thinks their child's beautiful, don't they? I mean, I don't know anybody that they had their child and they said, "Well, that's an ugly one." That's pretty. This may seem goofy to you, but when our first son Dylan was born, I remember thinking, "That's the prettiest baby I ever seen in my life." And that's not the goofy part, but I'm getting to that. But when we had him, I thought, "Man, that's the prettiest baby I ever seen in my life." And so Sheila was pregnant with Lane. And I remember thinking, when he was getting ready to be born, what if this one's ugly? I mean, that's just how my goofy mind thinks. And I thought, what if this one's ugly? And, the first one was pretty, and this one, what if this one's ugly? He wasn't ugly either, but But, I told you it was goofy. But they didn't look the same, right? Lane didn't look the same as Dylan. Parker didn't look the same as either one of them. Right? Parker was hairy all over. He was Esau. He had hair on his back and everywhere. But we wore it off with a little sandpaper, but he did fine. But no, I'm teasing. We didn't. But, by our perspective, they're still pretty babies, even though they're different. There's different features about them. But you see the account in Exodus 2:2, and you get a little more detail about it. He says, "And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months." Now, goodly can mean handsome or fair also, but it also can mean favored. Favored, meaning she knows God has chosen him for some kind of purpose, and they refuse to give him up because of that. God has a purpose for this child. It's not just for their enjoyment. It's not just because it's their son and they don't want to give him up for that reason there. But God has a purpose, and he's favored him, and they refuse to give him up, even at risk of being punished by Pharaoh, by the king there, for disobeying. But if Moses is going to lead God's people, he has to be willing to lead. That has to be his choice. Right? What's interesting is when he first tried to lead, he failed. He killed an Egyptian instead of doing it the right way. And Moses had to accept failure as a part of learning how to lead. And we read these verses there. We read them earlier, verse 13 and 14 of Exodus 2. "And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known." Now, in any kind of leadership position, whether that's in a church, whether that's in your family, whether that's at work, whatever it is, we're going to make some mistakes. And those mistakes are going to hurt our ability to lead in the future, because some people will lose respect for us, those type of things, even your own children there, and they may reject our leadership because of that. But it can't end there. Moses did make a huge mistake by killing that Egyptian there, right? But when they said, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us?" what was the answer? Who made Moses a prince and a judge over them? God did. God called him for that. Moses didn't choose that for himself. Pharaoh didn't choose that for Moses. God chose that for him. And God chose him. God protected him. God put him in that position in Pharaoh's house to learn about the culture, learn about how they did things, learn how to deal with Pharaoh when he came back 40 years later. God was preparing him for something that wouldn't happen for decades later. But it still happened. We understand that. We don't stop parenting just because we make mistakes as parents, do we? You don't say, "Well, I messed up. I burnt the kid's toast. Give him up now." "Oh, I whipped the wrong one. I thought sure that was the one that was lying to me, and it was this other one." And no, we don't quit parenting because we make mistakes. Same thing's true when we're witnessing for God. Sometimes we won't know what to say. Like Moses there, when they asked him, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us?" he could have said, "Well, God chose me for that position." You ever witness to somebody and you're trying to talk to them about God, right? And they ask you something or they say something and you don't know what to say back, right? And so you leave and you get about 2 seconds down the road and you think, "Oh man, why didn't I say that? Why didn't I remember that Bible verse? Why didn't I do that?" And you're rolling it over your head and you say, "Oh, I made a mistake. I should have done that differently." You don't just quit witnessing, do you? No. You remember that for the next time. There. So Moses accepts God's authority over everybody else. There. He accepts failure as a part of growing and learning to lead others. Here's another one there in 28 and 29. He says, "Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, asswaying to do, were drowned. Now Moses accepts God's plan. In order for them to escape Egypt, it had to involve death. It had to involve death. There were going to be children, babies, even grown adults who were the firstborn in their family. They were going to die. It involved death there. But it didn't have to be their death. It didn't have to be their death. In order for us to escape hell, we know there has to be death. That had to be Jesus. If it's not Christ in our place, then it's us. That's the only two choices. There has to be death involved. Most of us know the events of the Red Sea crossing, where it seemed like they were home free. They get to that last plague, the firstborn dies during the night, and they just want them out of there at that point in time. The land is in absolute shambles. Crops have been destroyed. Flocks and herds have been destroyed. Right? The servants are begging them. Right? Don't you know that Egypt's destroyed? Just let them go. Right? And they finally, they're at the death of the firstborn. And the people, they want them gone so bad. Right? It says they lent to them. Right? But they gave them wealth. They gave them money. Take whatever you want. Just leave. Just leave. That's the attitude there. And so when they leave, seems like they're home free. They got money in their pocket. They've got their freedom that they haven't had in years now. They're pushed out to escape there. And then God does something that they didn't plan for. He actually leads them into a trap. He leads them into a trap. God's leading them by the pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. And so he leads them, and he circles them back around, and he runs them right up to the edge of the Red Sea. Pharaoh thinks they're entangled in the wilderness, that they can't get out. They can't escape. And that's when he changes his mind. He says, I can't believe we let all of our slave labor leave. Let's go get them. Let's go bring them back. There. And when they come out, they're marching an army against them. What weapons do the Hebrew people have then? None. None. Why not? You don't let slaves have weapons, especially if you think they're outnumbering you. They're not allowed to have weapons. They don't have swords. They don't have spears. They don't have weapons at any sort. And so now you've got an army that's fully armed, armor, right, chariots, all of those things coming against them. They're unarmed. And they assume what? We're going to get killed. We're going to get killed. No place to run. They're backed up against the Red Sea. You remember what God does to separate the Egyptian army from the Israelites? He takes that pillar of fire and does what? He moves it behind them. It was leading them initially. He led them right up to the edge of the Red Sea. And he takes that pillar of fire and he moves it behind them. And it's separating the Egyptian army from the Israelite army all night. God splits the waters of the Red Sea. The wind's drying the bed, right? So it's not muddy and marshy when they're trying to get across with their herds and their babies and their wagons and all those things that they're taking across, and God dries that all up. By faith, they walk through a wall of water on both sides, and they walk through there, trusting God to keep them safe. And then the Egyptians assume, well, if they did it, what? We can too. We can too. And God lets them get halfway, right out in the middle. Then he collapses the water and they drown. And that's how Israel gets their weapons, right? They're going to have to fight eventually. Remember how Israel got their weapons? What happens to the Egyptian soldiers after they're drowned? Their bodies washed up on the shore. They've got swords, they've got spears, they've got shields. They've got all those things that Israel's going to need when they eventually have to fight, and God give it to them. They proved their faith was real. Moses did that, led the people that way. And some of them, they had moments when it was weak. It was weak. And they had moments when they failed God. Moses did too. But the end goal was the most important. I want to be with God. I want God to bless us. Okay. We'll see more next time, Lord willing. Any questions or comments, though?